This video is for 10.6, and in this video we're working on the midpoint and finding the midpoint of a segment, and then also how to use one of the endpoints and the midpoint to find another endpoint of a segment. Okay, this is simple arithmetic. So the first thing you got to know is, what are these things that they call endpoints? Endpoints of a segment are the two end positions here. Now the first position is identified as point 1, and its coordinates are x sub 1, y sub 1. The second endpoint has coordinates x sub 2, y sub 2. And the reason why they have those subdirectories on there is just to identify them as two unique positions. All right? In the very middle of two endpoints, we have this thing right here that is called a midpoint. A midpoint is exactly halfway between the two endpoints. Now, algebraically, they give us this formula for midpoint, and it says, in short, to find the midpoint, add the x's, divide by 2, add the y's, divide by 2, and that will give you this coordinate point that is called the midpoint. So let's start off trying to do that. To find the midpoint, we are going to add our x's, 6 plus negative 3, and divide by 2. Add our y's, 7 and 2, 7 plus 2, and divide by 2. You got to remember to do the x from each coordinate and the y from each coordinate. Now it's simple arithmetic. The midpoint is going to be 6 plus negative 3, or 3 over 2, and 7 plus 2, or 9 over 2. And I would leave them in that fraction form, but you could have written them as 1.5 and 4.5. Okay? Let's try one more just to make sure we got this. To find the midpoint, you're going to add the x's, divide by 2, add the y's, divide by 2. So I go to a coordinate position here, and I say negative 3 plus 5 divided by 2. Those are my two x values. And negative 4 plus negative 2 divided by 2. Those are my two y values. I simplify. Negative 3 plus 5 is 2. Divided by 2. 2 divided by 2 gives me 1. Negative 4 plus negative 2 is negative 6. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. That tells me between those two given endpoints, this would be the midpoint. Now, how we extend this is, what if I give you an endpoint and the midpoint? All right, I wrote down a midpoint. It should be the midpoint. All right, there's only one midpoint between two endpoints. All right, so there's two different ways to do this. There's an algebraic way and a conceptual way. In the algebraic way, what you do is a direct application of the midpoint formula. So let me show you. Instead of, back in the formula, how we said midpoint equals this formula thing here. All right? Algebraically, what we're going to say is this midpoint, 3, negative 5, is equal to this formula where I have to use this negative 10 as an x and this 5 as a y, but I only know one of the two pieces in the formula. So I'm going to say negative 10 plus x divided by 2 and 5 plus y divided by 2. Again, why am I writing those x and y's like that? Because that's what I'm trying to find. That's going to be the coordinates of the second endpoint. All right? So I need to figure out what's going to make this negative 10 plus x divided by 2 become 3. So let's write that down. Negative 10 plus x divided by 2. How do I make it 3? We also have to figure out 5 plus y divided by 2. How do we make that negative 5? And what that creates is two algebraic equations for us to solve. I'm going to multiply both sides by 2, which would leave me with negative 10 plus x is equal to 6. And then add 10, that's going to give me x is equal to 16. I now have to solve the second one. Multiply both sides by 2. I get 5 plus y is equal to negative 10. Subtract the 5, and that tells me that y is negative 15. I'm now ready to put these two back together as a coordinate point and the missing endpoint would be 16, negative 15. This is the algebraic way to do it. This is the way that most textbooks, most videos are going to tell you to do it. I prefer to do it conceptually. But to do it conceptually, you have to understand what a midpoint is and where it is located. I know that a midpoint is exactly in the middle of an endpoint and another endpoint. It's exactly in the middle. Now in this particular problem, they tell me that one of the endpoints is negative 10, 5. So I'm going to just simply write that down under my endpoint heading. They tell me that the midpoint is 3, negative 5. So I write that down. I have to find this other endpoint. And conceptually, another way to do it, because the midpoint is exactly halfway between the two endpoints, is all I got to be able to do is know how to count or do simple addition or subtraction. So you got to kind of pay attention here as I do this. It's a very simple technique. I know if I look just at the x's, to go from negative 10 to 3, I added 13. That's halfway to the other endpoint. If I add 13 to 3, that takes me to the x coordinate of the other endpoint. Do the same thing with the y's. To go from 5 to negative 5, I subtract 10, but I'm only halfway there. So I subtract 10 again from the negative 5, and that takes me to negative 15. If you notice, this endpoint and the endpoint we found algebraically are exactly the same thing. So let's try one more just to make sure you kind of see conceptually how this works. I know that I have in a segment, or when they're talking about a midpoint, I'll have an endpoint, a midpoint, and another endpoint. And the second endpoint is what they want me to find. I am given that the first endpoint is 15, negative 10. I am given that the midpoint is 4, negative 3, but now I got to find the other endpoint. I know to go from 15 to 4, I subtract 11. So I subtract 11 again, but this time from 4, and that takes me to negative 7. To go from negative 10 to negative 3, I add 7. So I add 7 again to negative 3, and that takes me to 4. In my opinion, this is a much easier, faster way to find an endpoint than to do it algebraically like I showed. Hopefully this helps. Good luck on your homework. Let me know if you have any questions.